Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about for the next 25 minutes or so is a new specification that we have brought out during the summertime underneath the OpenAPI Initiative umbrella. So this is the first time that we have moved from being a single specification project under the Linux Foundation into now a multi-specification project, and we have another specification also coming out into the near future, which I'm happy to talk to anybody about afterwards as well, which is called overlays. But today I'm going to talk specifically about the Arazzo specification. Anyone wondering on the name? It's the Italian for tapestry, but we couldn't use tapestry for trademarking reasons. So we came up with Arazzo. So tiny bit about me. My name is Frank. I am a Principal API Technical Evangelist at SmartBear, which is a bit of a wordy title, but effectively I'm a software engineer and I'm an architect, and I have a great passion for developer experience and really trying to push the boundary on what delivers good experience from an API consumer perspective. And outside of my work at SmartBear, I do a lot of work with the OpenAPI Initiative as well. Okay, so what I'm going to kind of take you through, I'm going to just set the scene a little bit as to why we decided to move into delivering more specifications under the OpenAPI Initiative. I'll then talk a little bit about what Arazzo is, fill you in on the use cases that we focused on as a working group, and why we decided it was a good initiative for the broader community to launch a new specification. I'll then take you through the structure. So it's a pretty simplistic specification, actually, at least in its current iteration. And we'll apply it to an example after you have a bit of a grounding in the structure, and then happy to take any questions. I guess one thing I would say is I work with a lot of companies in my roles, trying to figure out where they are from an API maturity perspective, trying to support them setting up their API strategy and actually executing upon it. And I'm always surprised how much they are really struggling with the concept of being able to deliver good API documentation. And what I would say, so warning, you're going to see a few bad memes in this talk. But really, if you're in the process of producing APIs at enterprise scale and you don't value documentation, then your house really is on fire. You know, if you don't have good documentation, you hinder the ability for you to be able to properly catalog your API portfolio. If you can't catalog your API portfolio, it's very difficult for your internal teams and or your external consumers to know what APIs you have. So if you can't discover APIs, you can't use APIs. And if you can't use APIs, then those APIs are actually pretty useless in the end. And that will hinder the success of your API and ultimately probably your API program as well. Now, a lot of people, when they think about API documentation, you may say, well, don't be too dramatic, Frank. We're aware of the challenge here, and we use things like OpenAPI or AsyncAPI to describe and document our APIs. But of course, for me, that's just reference documentation. So that's the technical, let's say, incarnation of the functionality of your API, but it doesn't necessarily paint the full picture from a consumer perspective. So it's like looking at the ingredients on a particular menu, but it doesn't give you any mechanism or instruction as to how you actually need to cook the meal. And what we're actually seeing out there is an alignment gap. So some of these charts are from our State of Software Quality report in SmartBear from last year, where we surveyed about 2,400 or 2,600 individuals across 18 industry verticals to determine what they're doing from an API perspective. And 74% of the survey group identified as being both an API consumer and an API producer. So they wear both hats, depending on the situation, but only 48% of them were actually confident that their APIs are well documented enough to describe the value that's on offer. And approximately 43% were actually unsure that they had the processes in place in their SDLC to actually deliver the same consumer experience that they would hold providers that they're consuming from to account. So they know what it is to feel and consume a good API, but they don't quite know how to deliver a good API. And we actually haven't really helped from the specification side of the house. more often than not when it comes to consuming an API, you need to do more than a single call. So you actually need to do a whole sequence of calls to be able to extract the value, integrate that value into your own software, and ultimately reap the reward of reusing an existing API rather than building from scratch. But we don't have any specification out there right now. There's older things like Beeple, of course, and I was talking to some people yesterday about BPMN, but that is not necessarily working well and cannot be necessarily integrated into the delivery process for APIs in the modern stack. So what is the Arazzo specification, and why do we think it helps the problems that I'm talking about here? Well, it describes an approach to document use case orientated workflows in a programmatical readable format. So the formats we're talking about here are JSON and YAML. So they're sufficiently human readable, but they're also very parsable and understandable by machines. And of course, when I talk about a workflow here, it's nothing more than a series of API calls, which when woven together, help the consumer achieve their job to be done. Now, the use cases that we focused on from a working group perspective are as follows. So ultimately, fundamentally, we wanted to be able to provide a deterministic recipe for the use of APIs. So I think every one of us probably can identify with a situation where we've asked for access to an API, we get access, we get the OpenAPI description, but there's 500 endpoints in it. And we're like, oh, thanks, that's great, but actually what do I need? In what sequence do I need to make the calls here to achieve this particular use case? In the flip side of that, maybe the provider has a more modular approach and they separate their concerns across multiple API descriptions. But again, we don't have any way to formally express how you can chain multiple APIs from different OpenAPI descriptions to help a consumer achieve their job to be done. And we want to tackle head on the problem of stale documentation and actually have something that can have the properties that are more living, more real, more always in sync with the actual implementation and deployment of the API. So I don't know how many of you have been involved in producing APIs and delivering them to production and having lots of consumers of those APIs. But what I've experienced over the years is ultimately when you're onboarding consumers to your APIs, you can have real goals for self-service. But what I've seen more often than not is there is this static form of documentation that is also accompanying the APIs. Now that could be HTML that's embedded into a developer portal, but more often than not, it's other human readable formats. So it's diagrams that are crafted and put into PDF form or PowerPoint presentations or whatever the case may be. They're shared out of band with the consumers. And as soon as you invest in doing that, it's very hard for you actually to keep that documentation up to date because it's not in sync with the delivery team who's actually producing the API. We also want to be able to assert continuously that the business value on offer or the use cases that you're exposing are actually always assertable. So if you have a use case that spans multiple API calls, maybe across different APIs, if one of those underlying APIs change, can you still assert that that overarching offering is still working as expected by your consumers? We want to reinvigorate some of the tooling ecosystem around code generation and SDK generation for APIs. So again, if you go back to that large unwieldy API description, like think of the GitHub OpenAPI description. I think it's, I don't know how many, I think it's like 30,000 lines long or something like that. Got tons and tons of endpoints. If you generate code from that using a boilerplate code generation, even like our own Swagger code gen, you equally get bloaty stub code that's created because you have all operations in there, all schemas in there, etc. But what if you could generate code specifically for the use case that you're interested in as a consumer? You no longer get any paths that you can accidentally navigate down. You're kept on that golden path to help you achieve and integrate that use case into your code. We're working with lots of other groups to improve regulatory assertability. We're working with some of the open banking organizations to give them a means to validate if providers in their jurisdiction are actually meeting their regulatory requirements with regards to the APIs they expose. We're also working with the OpenID Connect Foundation because it's actually quite hard to describe financial grade API interactions just using OpenAPI. And so Arazzo gives a mechanism to be able to describe that in a way that can be also asserted. And of course, the elephant in the room for us as well, while we were working with the working group to get to the release, was the AI potential. So there was lots of folks coming to say, what is this going to mean from an AI perspective? And of course, it brings a lot of potential to the AI agents that are out there. So if you're delegating responsibility to an AI agent to perform a pretty sensitive transaction on your behalf, you want to make sure that works first time right and every time right. You can't afford for any hallucinations to occur. So if I'm moving money from my account to Pedro's account, I want to make sure that it's the right amount that's moved. I don't want that to go wrong and accidentally another zero be added on. So that is one thing, and one of the things that we're also focusing on is trying to nip some anti-patterns in the bud that are already emerging. So what we're seeing is that there's actually semantic stuffing happening to make APIs work with certain LLM models. So what teams are doing is they are stuffing in additional semantics into the responses to add enough breadcrumbs to give some ability for the model to actually make the next call. Now that's fine, but for me, that's adding immediate technical debt. And again, it's not interoperable. So what works for an OpenAI model might not work for Gemini or something else. So we're trying to kind of kill that anti-pattern that I'm calling a backend for LLM before it happens, hopefully. So there's some of the dominant use cases. Now, what does the Arazzo specification structure look like? Well, this is it on a page, so it's pretty simple. If you're familiar in any way with OpenAPI or AsyncAPI, this type of layout should look somewhat familiar to you. And I'll just walk through it very briefly. So there's an info object at the start, and that just contains some metadata about the document that you're actually crafting. So if we look at an example of that, and apologies for the dark background here, it might be hard for you to see it. So an info object has a title, it has a summary, it has a description, it has a version, so that's just the version of the specific document that you're crafting, and then it conforms to a version of the Arazzo specification. We then have the concept of source description. So think of these as namespaces. So this is you setting the boundary for which the workflow or workflows that you're crafting in the current document can be described over. So again, you're being very explicit as to what references you're pulling in from an API perspective. So if we look at this example, I'm just specifying two source descriptions. They are both of type OpenAPI, and I'm providing the URL to where those OpenAPI descriptions can be retrieved from. Moving on then, we have the workflows themselves, which of course describe the workflows to be taken across one or more APIs to help the consumer achieve a particular objective. If we look at this, each workflow, it has an ID, it has a summary, it has a description, and then it has other objects and properties here that I'll take you through. So it has inputs, so these are inputs that are going to be provided by the calling context into the workflow. So things that the workflow can't determine itself, they have to be passed in. It has parameters, success actions, and failure actions. These are just reusable parameters or success actions that will be then applicable to all the underlying steps. It has steps, they're the parts that actually do the work. Then you have a depends on capability if you want to have some chaining between workflows. And at the very end, a workflow will return outputs to the consuming context. So I'll briefly walk through these. So the inputs is just simple JSON schema object. So JSON schema 2012 version. And again, we don't expect people to get very exotic with the inputs here. So if we look at an example of this, I'm just describing an input object. Here it has 4 properties, and 3 of the properties are required by the workflow to get past start. Then moving on to the steps. So these each represent a call to an API or maybe to another workflow. So in this particular example, a step has an ID, it has a description, it then has some mechanism for referencing an API operation. So if the OpenAPI that you're referencing actually describes operation IDs, great, you can use that directly. If not, you can use an operation reference. So you can use a JSON pointer reference into a particular operation in the API that you're targeting. It then has the concept of success criteria. So this is what tells whatever is processing the step itself, what determines if this step is successful. And I'll walk through the inner parts of that. So parameters, very simple, a list of parameter objects representing parameters to pass into an API operation. So this is where you're being very explicit about how we need to map some things that we've got in a previous step, or maybe some things that have come in as part of the inputs, and how will we pass those into the API operation that we're about to invoke. So in this particular example, we have some parameters, and I'm just mapping them to query parameters on the API operation, and I'm using ABNF expression syntax to describe something that is evaluated at runtime. We then have the concept of failure actions and success actions, and these kind of do what they say on the tin. So if the success criteria has determined that this step is not successful and you have failure actions described, then they potentially will get evaluated to see if they should be executed. So if we look at this particular example, the criteria for success actions and failure actions determine whether or not it's applicable for that particular context. So if the API that I invoked as part of the step returned a status, HTTP status code 503, then I want to retry this particular step, and I want to retry that after 1 second and exhaust the retries after the retry limit. I can enrich this even further for a retry, so I could reach out to another step, or I could reach out to another workflow. So a very common example would be, imagine if I got a 401 status code back from the API, I inspected the token, I determined that the token was expired, I could then reach out to a refresh token workflow, and then when it comes back, I could retry the current step again. So this is a retry type. The other types that are supported are end, does what it says in the 10. If the criteria holds true, then let's just end the process at this point in time. There's no point in proceeding. And we also have the concept of goto, which is a one-way transfer of context to another label that exists within the Arazzo documents. That could be another step, or it could be another workflow. Success actions is very similar, and these are just optional things that you want to do upon success of a step. If they're not defined, the steps just get executed sequentially. So you could imagine that if I determine, based on the criteria, that a certain condition holds true, then I can skip steps that are sequential and I can jump on to another step. So it's just to aid the speed of processing. And then we have the concept of step outputs, which are very, very simple. They're just a friendly map between a dynamic output and a value. So in this particular instance, I have a pet ID output, and I'm describing the value that will be returned, which again is expressed as a runtime expression here. And at the very end, we then have outputs, and this is very similar. So these will just be the outputs that are returned to the calling context that invoked the workflow. Here's an example just returning 3 outputs that are grabbed from different steps that have executed as part of the workflow itself. And then there's the concept of reusability with regards to how you construct your Arazzo document as well. So you can define different things at a reusable level and use them across different workflows or different steps, so you don't have to inline everything. So let's run through a very, very quick example. So let's imagine that we are working for a free student debt bank, and the problem that we're trying to solve is that we want to give local retailers the ability to prepare for the student rush. So imagine we're like back in August, everyone's getting ready to start university, they all want new equipment, but we don't want to add to their student debt. So we've come up with a buy now, pay later with a 0% loan rate that we can allow retailers to redeem as part of their checkout process on their e-com solution. So the example workflow here to enable the buy now, pay later would be that the steps that would have to be potentially done by the consuming developers is check that the selected products that are in the basket are applicable for a buy now, pay later process. retrieve the terms and conditions to determine customer eligibility, create a new customer record if needed in the system of record, initiate that loan transaction, get authentication and authorization from the user, calculate the payment, show that amortization schedule to the student, and then if they redeem it, then we need to obviously update the order status in the backend system. Now, internally, we have two different teams building APIs that are responsible for this process. So we have a buy now, pay later eligibility API, and we have a buy now, pay later loan API, two independent APIs. And what we want to make available to the developers on the retail e-commerce side is basically bring that workflow to life for them. So we now have the ability, instead of just giving them this reference, documentation, and other static diagrams to help them do their work, we can provide them with an Arazzo description that will describe deterministically how they need to achieve this. Now, what we've always said is the value here is not in the YAML, or it's not in the JSON that we're giving to the consumers, but it's the affordability that it will bring through the tooling that will be built up around the specification. So you can imagine that as a consuming developer, as much as I do love YAML, it's maybe not the most the first thing that I want to receive to help me achieve my job to be done, but you can very easily imagine that the tooling will be built on top of this to render this in a more dynamic, a more intuitive way to really help me achieve that integration and reduce my mean time to integration as a consuming developer. And just to give you a little flavor of how this could work and how quickly we could create these things, I have a little custom GPT that I've trained on the Arazzo specification, ask it to describe 3 benefits. Of course, these things are good at producing text, so not surprisingly, it gives me some pretty realistic benefits. Then I provided that workflow that we just described, and it does a pretty decent first pass at creating the Arazzo document for me. And apologies, it's really hard to see this with the lights in here. Now I take that, I ask it to do some additional work with regards to how it will render this, because I like seeing the workflow in a tabular format. I also ask it to give me Mermaid and Plant UML syntax. So you can imagine that I can easily wire this up as part of my CI/CD process with some additional manual massaging. I can embed it into my developer portal where I have my eligibility API, I have my loans API, but now because of Arazzo, I also have a really intuitive getting started guide for the consuming developer. So this is the table that I asked it to produce. So it tells me the endpoints I need to call, what I need to pass in, what I need to be expecting, and what's of interest to me as part of the response object. It gives me some diagrams, and I can also use Arazzo together with some deterministic code generation to actually generate representative client SDKs for the consumers. So again, this is not just the full surface area of the APIs. This is something that is very specific to that buy now, pay later use case, which is quite powerful. So what does the tooling ecosystem look like? So of course, this is a very young specification. It was just launched in the summertime, but already we're seeing tooling being created by vendors that are in the space. So LibLab have built an SDK generator from Arazzo. Redocly are doing work from a testing perspective and a linting perspective. API-Matic are building also guided walkthroughs, so a very stepwise instruction for consuming developers. Speakeasy are working on testing, and I always get asked, well, what are we doing from a smartware and stoplight perspective? We're working on quite a lot of tooling as well, and we launched Arazzo support in Spectral. Not sure if anyone here knows Spectral. It's probably the most well-known API linter that's out there. So if we look at a very, very quick example of that. So this is me just taking the Arazzo document that was crafted by the custom GPT, and I never trust what a GPT will give back to me. So I can just very easily ask Spectral to provide me some feedback on the Arazzo document that was created, and immediately I get some validation feedback that there was errors in it. I can fix those. I can tidy up the Arazzo document myself and then feed it back into the GPT to get the consumer documentation that I just showed you. So the call to action, I think, for everyone here is, I would encourage everyone, if you are interested or see potential for how this can improve the consuming experience or even the provider experience for anything that you do with APIs, please do feel free to join the Slack workspace for OpenAPI. Check out the Arazzo specification. We also have a relatively healthy examples repository, and that's getting enriched all of the time. But yeah, just any feedback or any questions that people have, I'm happy to engage. But one of the real values of this is that it's vendor neutral, it's vendor agnostic, so that will be good for everybody. It's not tied to us from a smartware perspective. It's all safely under the Linux Foundation as an open source project under the OpenAPI Initiative. So that's it, everyone. Any questions? Happy to take some.
Thank you for that. It was very interesting to see something interconnecting the flows and such as really cool. I was wondering, would it be possible to write an Arazzo description or an Arazzo document, I don't know how you call it, with, modeling third-party APIs you don't maintain to build clients who complex flows between external APIs that design a product that integrates different external sources, or do you need to do something and the API itself? So it's completely independent, I guess.
Yeah, so the question was, is there a valid use case where a consumer could kind of mash up lots of different APIs from different providers and then build a client using Arazzo or make that Arazzo description available to their consumers? So the answer is yes, absolutely. So again, clients can, or consumers can determine, for their own teams or maybe even for their own customers, the capabilities that they want to make available, so they can effectively mash up. Like, that's the beauty about APIs. They are effectively Lego building blocks, so you can assemble them and you can then expose that additional value add to your consumers. And yeah, Arazzo is well suited for that type of use case.
So my question is about the alignment with other standards bodies or organizations like that, in particular OMG. And the reason for asking about OMG is that for SysML v2 there's now an API definition out in the open that's up for standardization that would surely benefit from having a specification like this, and also your previous talk, because there's a lot of debate about how to make sure that we get vendor neutral implementation to which people can actually show compliance. So is there any initiative from your side to engage with OMG to help make the SysML v2 API specification more robust, let's put it like this?
Okay, so the question was, do we have engagements with the OMG standards body, and are we trying to work with lots of standards bodies that are out there to help improve the quality of the APIs that they're exposing? So we don't have a formal process for it, but we do try to engage with as many bodies as we can. OMG, no, haven't, but I'm happy to engage with them. If you'd like to do an introduction, more than happy to engage with them. We are working with the OIDC group, so the OpenID Connect Foundation, to try and add a little bit more verbosity and value to the work that they're doing. We're also working with groups like the Open Travel Alliance, so they see massive benefits for Arazzo for them. So you can imagine they're dealing with airlines, with hospitality, the whole hospitality sector, so hotels, trains, taxis, restaurants, the whole shebang, and they would really like to craft Arazzo descriptions that will allow them to kind of, between a mixture of carrots, chocolate, and sticks, point to all of the providers to say, we need you to be able to conform to these types of specifications. We're also working with the AsyncAPI group. So they are another project that are under the Linux Foundation, because we will be adding support for AsyncAPI to Arazzo as well. So then you will be able to describe workflows across request-response oriented APIs as well as event-based APIs as part of a workflow, which is again a very practical use case. But we are we're open to engaging with lots. Camara actually is another example. So they're a project that are trying to standardize APIs for the kind of telecoms networking industry. So we're working with them as well. They see interest in being able to craft Arazzo descriptions too. But yeah, if anyone has a standards group that they think might benefit from this, we're open to engage.
No, we don't have time for any other questions. So, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.